Barry Fagin is our Senior Fellow of Technological Policy, or is it Tech Policy? All I know is when my Wi-Fi password is lost, I give you a call.
Yeah, and I bill you $2,500.
Yeah, that works out beautifully. So when you're not working at Geek Squad, you do tech policy. You're also a professor of technical sciences. Let me ask you about what happened last week out in D.C. And there's nothing quite as enjoyable as flogging successful businessmen.
Sure.
It's a beautiful.
Congress does
it's what Congress does best. How dare you be successful? So they brought up the heads of Facebook, Apple, Google, and Amazon.
Correct.
For the congressional bludgeoning. That being said, I'm sympathetic with some of the gripes that have been thrown at these guys. I do believe that those platforms, particularly the social media platforms, have been unfriendly to conservatives and libertarians, and not outright censorship, but I believe the AI that runs it pushes us back. I'm convinced. I've had my own posts deleted. Don't tell me these guys. I'm shocked. I tell you, shocked.
Such things would go on.
Right now, let's just focus on Facebook. Social media is the way we communicate now. And it goes through this one company, and that's a lot of power. Too much power, right?
No. Or rather, too much. What does that mean? More than you would like? More than I would like? Maybe. But part of what capitalism is, and part of what a free, voluntary society is, it means that you don't get to impose your will on others. It means that what government is supposed to do is to prevent harm, to come in when harm happens. But just because Facebook or any social media platform doesn't represent the views or doesn't allow you to present your views on what is their platform, you may have a gripe, but you shouldn't have the law on your side. Sometimes it's just kind of, it's just tough. It's their platform.
Let me do it this way. We used to have some natural monopolies. And at one point, the telephone system fell into the world of natural monopolies. Not so much any longer, thank God. But the idea that we'd have government come in to make sure that it played fairly because it was the system that was being used. And right now, the system that is being used to communicate, more so than a phone system, is social media, which is run by just a couple of folks.
So why is
it a monopoly, and therefore needs some regulation?
So I would say the answer is no. It is not a monopoly. The worst kind of monopolies are, so as you say, natural monopolies, or even worse, legal monopolies, where it's actually illegal to compete with them, and that is certainly not the case with Facebook. Why is it that Facebook is being used? Because it's really useful, because it's so popular, because with minimal effort, you can reach literally millions or even billions of people. So there's tremendous value there. But the price that Facebook asks is that if you are going to present and use their platform, it's their platform and you have to abide by their rules. If you don't like it, then you can and should start your own. Now,
whoa, that's easy to say, but it's like saying, if you don't like the customer service at United Airlines, start your own airline. That it is too much of a push to be able to do that. And I give credit to some great companies that do it. Caucus Room here in Colorado. If you don't have an account with caucusroom.com, you need to get one. It is the answer to this question, and they are doing that. But for companies or people who don't have millions of dollars to try to launch their own thing and make it sticky enough that everybody wants to be part of, it's really easy to say, well, start your own company. But if you're out there and you want to get your message across, if Facebook blocks you out or hinders your searches, what are you going to do? If Google ranks you low in the searches, as I believe they do, what are you going to do? Same thing happens on YouTube, which Google owns, and they like to hide the things you don't want to see. I see it all the time.
So I'd say we live in a less than perfect world. Everyone lives in a less than perfect world. I can imagine a world where circumstances are different, where the technology companies are different, where the social media acceptance of various points of view is different. But that doesn't mean that I have a right to make it happen. And I would caution that the perfect is the enemy of the good. And how are you going to fix Facebook to do the things that you want? Well, I mean, you could call for a boycott. You could, as we mentioned, start your own. But if that's too expensive or it's just the opportunity costs are too great, well, do you really want government to do that? Because at some point, the worm will turn and they'll come for you.
They're already coming for me.
It's not a scalpel. It's a
But so many
sledgehammer.
conservatives feel the way that I feel, which is there's not a fair shake through these technology companies. That Facebook buries what we want to do, that Google and YouTube, which they own, buries what we want to get out, that our podcasts, our videos get pushed down to the bottom of search rankings. Well, prove that. Well, we can't prove that because they have the proprietary information. The left is angry because these are successful businesses, and I think a lot of people on the right and libertarians are angry because they're being discriminated against on these what seems like open platforms.
So that may very well be true, but sometimes the alternatives are worse. If in order to do that, if you want to ensure that your point of view is addressed on Facebook or Google, or that you're ranked fairly or whatever, et cetera, you've got to use a tool that is very unwieldy, very risky, and is likely to backfire. And frankly, I'm very worried about free speech concerns, even though I understand that conservatives and libertarians may very well have a legitimate beef that their views are not given equal airing, and that the AI algorithms that these companies used, any AI algorithm suffers from bias, so there's no reason to believe that Facebook's and Google's AI algorithms do not. But nonetheless, as a successful plaintiff in a Supreme Court case that established the rules for free speech and the First Amendment free speech protections way back in 1996, when the internet was just a glimmer in the eyes of a few geeks, I'm very, very worried. I am much more comfortable living with the imperfections of a Facebook and a Google, whose role basically really is trying desperately to satisfy the needs of millions of happy users. I'd much rather live with the imperfections of that than the imperfections of a government tribunal or committee that has to decide what's fair and what's not. What's going to happen when a Democratic president takes office? And then there's concerns about that their views aren't being represented. Yeah, sure, right now Google and Facebook are comfortably lefty. That may not always be the case.
As long as they're located in Silicon Valley, they will always be comfortably
okay,
lefty.
All right, fair enough.
The idea that they also have so much control of our information, that what we give them is we open our kimonos and they see everything. They know everything. And government can scoop up that information. It's amazing. In the 70s when we were kids, think about after Watergate, would you agree that we should have tracking devices on every person and that government should be able to monitor all communications between people? And we go, that's insane. No government, we would never allow the government to do that. But that's exactly what we did. And we did it voluntarily because it's so convenient. And they get all the information. Snowden proved that they do look at all of our stuff, and they do so en masse. There's no privacy. And so now the dirty work of government surveillance happens through those companies.
So there is, I think, a legitimate point to be made here. And there's a way, like in so many of these cases where these problems arise, there's a way to solve that with capitalism and property rights. One way to address that, part of the problem is that we don't have an adequate property rights system for information. We should instead start with the principle that all consumers, all individuals own their data, and they will part with it only under very specific circumstances, and then they'll be told what those circumstances are. And then companies and consumers can negotiate it and decide under what data they're willing to give up and under what circumstances. Now, that means that some will say, yeah, I don't care. I think there's tremendous value in that, and that's fine. Others may say, you know, I don't want to share my location, but I'll share my birth date and my age because there's useful things like that. The biggest problem is when these companies take your data and do things, and government as well, and do things with it without your consent. That's a problem, but that's what laws are for.
do they really give consent? Do we really give consent? In order to survive today, you need this data. You need this information. You need to be able to be online. You need to have your tracking device. You need to have all this good stuff. It's not like you could opt out of this and survive in this world.
So I think that's a little extreme. You can and do. I mean, my daughter, for example, isn't on Facebook, and she does just fine.
Does she have a smartphone?
She does.
Yes. Yeah. She have email accounts that can be looked at?
She does. She does. Yeah. Although, frankly, I trust Google to maintain the security of my email accounts far more than I would trust, say, the NSA or the government.
But the NSA can just ask for it at any time. They will hand it over. And there's not a whole lot we can do about that. My bugaboo with TSA. TSA invades our privacy so much that we will pay them money to get out and go into a faster line called pre-check. So, this is mobster work.
So, no, but that said, TSA is an example of a legal monopoly. Right? You can't...
But it gets worse. You don't pay to get out and in this other line just with money. You also pay with your privacy. Because before, if they wanted to know where Barry Fagin was going, they'd have to call all the airlines and get your itineraries. Here, you forfeit that information. You agree to forfeit it to get on the pre-check list. And you're willing to do that just so your life's a little bit more convenient.
So maybe people should do a better job of valuing their information and thinking about it and being aware of it than they currently do. Because we just click.
Well, hang on a second. So what that I'm more proud about my information? I signed up for pre-check knowing full well that I was being it was a shakedown. It was a shakedown from the government to get you to give up your information by putting you in a shorter line that you desperately needed. So that's not freedom. That's the opposite of freedom.
And let me point out, that's one of the greatest triumphs, sadly, of Al-Qaeda and 9/11. That's exactly the kind of thing that the terrorists won. And that now we now face this dilemma. We now have to give up our personal information and give up a little bit more of our freedom.
And I'll guarantee you, overwhelmingly, passengers do not realize that they're giving up their privacy by going into the pre-check line, by getting pre-check.
Yeah, probably true. Now, that said, you have to ask, well, why is the TSA necessary at all? I mean, after all, cruise ships are also have a similar security risk, and all the security on them is handled privately. And no one's concerned about how the information is managed because security systems, security firms on ships, they don't care about anything other than the fact that bad things don't happen on their ships. And so the incentive structure is very different. Now, that said, again, the perfect is the enemy of the good. There is no putting the genie back in the bottle. We are going to live in an imperfect world where information is out there floating and available more or less to anyone with sufficient skills, both legitimate and illegitimate. And as far as I can tell, people are willing to accept that because the convenience is so is tremendous. I mean, we were just talking before the taping. Primitive man used to have to hunt for information by getting up off the couch, and we
it was
have to
awful.
do that.
I remember that.
Yeah, it was horrible. And now we don't have to do anything. We just say, okay, Google, what's the 27th Amendment of the Constitution? And then we get the answer. Kids today have no idea, and that there is tremendous value in that to us. And I would argue that most of us are willing to trade off at least a little privacy for that in order to make that happen. Be quiet.
Yeah. All right. So I agree with you. There's definitely a better part of that. But see, and Google just won't shut up.
Yeah, well, as long as you got the off switch.
Yeah.
As long as
see, there was a time also where we had anonymity. And
it's much harder now.
You cannot have anonymity. We have cameras everywhere. We have facial recognition. We have, every time you log on, the world knows who you are, and it's traceable. People think that cryptocurrencies are a way to get rid of that. No, cryptocurrencies actually are even more identifiable. Once they get to whoever made that first transaction, they can follow them all the way through with Bitcoin. If they understand the original, if they can tie a person to a transaction.
That's a big if. And
we'll talk, but they can.
When we talk about encryption.
Let's talk about encryption right now. Years ago, there was something called PGE, pretty good encryption. And people would send emails through encrypted files. And finally, there was a big hubbubaloo about it. And
there's actually a Colorado connection with that, which I'll get to.
Yeah, because the guy who developed it came from Colorado.
So at least, I don't know if that's true or not, but that may be right. But his attorney actually lives in Colorado Springs, in fact, the guy who represented him. So the person you're talking about is Philip Zimmerman, and the program is called Pretty Good Privacy, and it's still in use today. It basically uses math, and math is just out there. It doesn't know or care about countries, organizations, politics, parties. It doesn't care about any of that. It's just math, and it's available to everyone. And his program used math to enable anyone to send completely secure, as far as we know, email to the point where a sixth grader could send an email to anyone else, maybe another sixth grader on another side of the world, that even the most powerful security apparatuses of a superpower couldn't read it. And that's just the nature of encryption as far as we can tell. And the policy back then, the regulations were so far behind that the Customs Department said, okay, and I may be wrong about the particular number, but it's not really important. You can have security up to, say, 128 bits, which is a measure of the strength of the security. That's okay in the United States, but you can't export it because that's a munition. That's a weapon. So there's this idea that math is somehow above a certain point is a weapon. So the guy's name who did this is Philip Zimmerman. He's a legend in the computer science. He said, he actually tested this point and said, okay, I am going to export not the encryption, but the source code or the algorithm. And he got arrested, and it was years, blah, blah, blah. And then finally, the right thing happened. People gave up and sort of realized that, you know what, this is sort of pointless. The genie is out of the bottle. But it's amazing how Congress continues over and over again to try to come up with some new law or some technique which will enable encryption to be, a sword for good in that smites the forces of evil when wielded with the right person, but somehow burns the hands of any evil person when they pick it up. It's not. It's a two-edged sword, and the same people who can get great privacy out of it. It also means that terrorist organizations and pedophiles can as well.
Why is privacy important? So, I am a privacy geek. I believe individuals have a right to privacy. I believe it's constitutional. I believe it's in the Fourth Amendment. I believe that as a human being, I am sovereign. And therefore, as a sovereign, I have a right to privacy. And that I can communicate with other sovereigns, including you, without anybody else knowing about that. But people don't like that. A lot of the old saying of, well, if you don't have anything to hide.
Oh yeah, exactly. Then yeah, why should you care? Well, there's a lot of reasons why you should care.
Well, give me a couple.
Yeah. So for example, you may be wielding ideas that are unpopular. You may have views that are unpopular, not illegal, but simply unpopular. You may legitimately want to keep certain of your aspects private, because there may be certain personal choices you made in terms of your lifestyle that are no one else's business. You may be legitimately suspicious of law enforcement agencies, even though you've done nothing wrong. But you might have, say, political opponents, right? There's, of course, that would never happen.
No,
right? No one would ever, no one would ever use the apparatus of law enforcement strictly for political purposes, right?
A lot of it also is. We Americans, maybe it's everywhere, maybe it's just being human, we're very short-sighted. And we take our situations where we are now and we project those to the indefinite future, which is, I can't see why this would be an issue. And we forget Nazi Germany wasn't all that far away. Carting people off was not that far away. It's not like those things are gone forever. We don't know. You look to the People's Republic of China, and what you see is a government that searches and follows people by their face, takes away their rights, they disappear in the middle of the night. This stuff happens. Well, it couldn't happen here. Who says it can't happen here? It might not be this generation. It might not happen for 100 years or 1,000 years. But the basis of human privacy, I believe, is a human right, and that government doesn't have a right to pry into what we have. There's a bill going through Congress right now to rip open that privacy? What is it?
So it's LAD, the Lawful Access to Encrypted Data Act. And, like so many of these bills, how could you possibly be against it, right? No, I'm only for unlawful access, right? It's like a bill in favor of motherhood. No, I'm opposed to motherhood. I think motherhood's an awful idea. It's very clever the way that all this is done. But what this law, which I'm embarrassed to say was proposed by Republicans, what this law tries to do anyway is, instead of what we call strong crypto, which is the nature of the cryptography that we were talking about, just based on pure mathematics, anyone can use encryption and can create emails and messages that no one else can read except the intended recipient, if you observe some basic precautions. What the sponsors of this act want to do is to have every encryption system made in America, because that's all that they can do, would be basically broken, would have a backdoor, something that, of course, provided when presented with a warrant and the law and probable cause, et cetera, then that would break the encryption and would open it. So, of course, everyone... Go ahead.
Let's remember that the head of the NSA, in sworn testimony to Congress, said, we do not do bulk collections of emails and texts. And then Eric Snowden puts it all out there. He lied. And I'm always amazed that the difference between those who have trust in government and those who don't. The left doesn't have trust in government when it comes to dropping bombs. Okay. The right doesn't have trust in government when it comes to all sorts of things, but yet they'll trust government when it comes to privacy. That police need to be able to look into this, or else we could have another 9/11. And we will scare you into opening up a back door so that we can look into everything you do online.
Well, I think both people have a very romantic understanding of how government actually works. That is, if you pass a law called the Patriot Act, that means that if you're opposed to it, you're not a patriot. They believe that the law will do what it says it will do, and B, only what it says it will do. And, in that sense, I think that's a very romantic, very unrealistic view. But particularly if either the left or the right, if there's a law that claims to do something that they really want, then they're inclined to believe it. It's sort of a form of wishful thinking. But there's no reason to think, A, that the forces of darkness would use American broken crypto systems. Of course they won't. I mean, ISIS already rolls their own crypto. They've written their own software that uses strong crypto. And imagine if we have a broken crypto now that has a backdoor.
And you use the term broken crypto, meaning that the federal government or government has a key that they can look in and check what you're saying and close it, but nobody else can.
Correct. And I would say anyone who has that key can then read it. So there's no reason to think that only our federal government would have it, but that's the intent anyway. But imagine, for example, if we sell then, assuming we would ever be able to sell or export our crypto to, say, China, well, of course, the Chinese government is going to want to have those keys. Otherwise, any authoritarian regime will either, if they buy our crypto, if they buy that, they're going to want the keys. And of course, we'll give it to them. We'll have
and again, when you say the word crypto, you mean encryption.
Encryption,
because
yes.
I hear crypto, I think cryptocurrencies, which are Bitcoin, are a whole different thing. You're only talking about encryption.
Correct. Yeah. So either we help authoritarian regimes all over the world, or else no one wants to buy our broken crypto systems anymore. And why will Americans then use broken encryption when pretty much any smart high schooler with the right kind of instruction can learn the math and can write their own code in order to do them? And it really is that simple.
Then it turns you into a criminal. So the act of wanting privacy, of being able to talk to your girlfriend or your brother or whomever without anybody...
Or your same-sex partner.
Or your same-sex, or somebody with whom you have a revolutionary idea, but you don't want to share it.
Sure. Intellectual property is one of the most important things to protect with strong encryption.
But the idea that in order to do that and do it privately, we're going to make you a criminal.
Right, that's
and it's the same thing we see in gun control. It's the same thing if you just want to be left the hell alone, by doing nothing, you're a criminal.
And that's why it's very frustrating for me to see some conservatives anyway supporting this kind of stuff, because who wants to be seen as aiding and abetting terrorists in encryption or pedophiles, right? How it's like being against motherhood, right? You couldn't possibly.
And it really shows the difference, and this is something that has fascinated me for over a quarter of a century, and something at Independence Institute we try to bring together conservatives and libertarians on the 98% of things that they agree on: property rights and lower taxation and free speech and all that other good stuff. But there are those issues that libertarians go, government doesn't have a right. Government is there to protect my privacy. Conservatives are there to say, no, government is there to provide rule of law and order, and law and order means we need to catch bad guys, otherwise we lose control of the system. So this is a natural break in what should be people on the right that work together.
Yeah, I'd agree. And of course, you don't want to spend a lot of time and energy on the small percentage of issues that divide us, but you don't want to ignore them either. Now, that said, there are allies on the in the crypto front in the high-tech world. For example, you may recall Tim Cook of Apple refused to open to unblock the encryption, the strong encryption of the iPhone in order to help an FBI law enforcement investigation.
And locally, there are fans who believe in privacy as well, including the owner of Tattered Cover Bookstore. We've had her on the show many years ago, who refused to give up her files to the FBI because they wanted to know who was buying what books. So there are people out there who say...
Can you say McCarthy? Can you say the 50s? Can you say the blacklist? So, right, it could never happen here. No. Right. The circle continues. And people should always remember, conservatives and liberals as well, should always ask, when a bill is being debated and you're thinking about the law, and at the moment you like it, you believe it's going to do something that you like, ask yourself, what is going to happen when the other party is in power?
I call it the 180 test, which is flip the parties around and see how it works. It works great with the media. When somebody on the right does something wrong, let's say, well, wait a second. If somebody on the left did it, would the media be acting the same way? And it does change it. The other thing I'd add to that question is not just flip it, but add time. Put yourself in a time machine. Go ahead 100 years. What happens? What happens when this law that government can open up any communication, any phone call, any email, and look at it? Where does that lead us in 100 years, given the advance of technology?
The natural tendency is for government to advance and liberty to yield.
Said by Thomas Jefferson,
Smart guy.
250 years ago.
Yep.
I'll add to that, though.
And yes, he was a slave owner, I know, and we can talk about that some other time.
The other part of that is, what law that says computing power goes up?
Moore's Law?
Moore's Law, thank you. So Moore's Law, which says that computing power roughly goes up, doubles every 2 years, and the price of that computing power gets cut in half every 2 years.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Now, if you put that on a straight trajectory, let's just say it continues that way. Not only does computers become self-aware, because then they take over the earth. But just before that, you realize that government can do anything and can look into any aspect of your lives. This is the idea that the Chinese government are following around people, know which one of them uses their computer in this way or that way, or has a internet protocol going to a different country with a VoIP line. No, I'm trying to. VPN, virtual network. They know all this stuff. England, they follow people throughout their cities on camera, all for safety, and it's all to make you feel good. Go out 100 years, and do you really feel safe when the government has that type of control?
Yeah, and that's why laws, the more draconian a law is, the more it needs a sunset provision. That is, every law, or at least the really significant ones, like the Patriot Act, for example, or this Encryption Act won't ever make it. But if it did, it should be revisited or shut down in 5 years unless it's affirmatively voted to continue. That's something that's really, really important. People just don't think about that.
I want to wrap this up, but let's bring it full circle to the 4 rich guys that came up in front of Congress to get their knuckles whacked. Had people say, do you realize how rich Bezos is?
He'll be our first trillionaire.
Yeah, he'll be a trillionaire, and that in itself is wrong. That type of wealth concentration into one person is dangerous for a free society, because anybody with that power can buy up media, as he has with the Washington Post and others, and therefore we need to do something to take his money and redistribute it, or break up his operations so he doesn't become too powerful.
Yeah, so there's a fundamental difference of opinion, a fundamental different perspective on the nature of wealth and the relationship between wealth and personal freedom that I think is an enormous gap and may be unbridgeable between conservatives and libertarians, or free marketers on the one hand, and the redistributionists, liberals and socialists on the other. And that is the idea of justice and fairness to us, to people who think the way we do, is independent of how much is accumulated. What determines it is how it is accumulated. If Bezos stole, 8 billion or hundreds of billions of dollars, if he had stolen his wealth, or to some lesser extent, if he had simply lobbied for it and used his sleazy contacts in government to get government contracts and government monopolies, as sadly many rich people do, then that's one thing, right? That's unjust. But if he got it through creating wealth, through the honest voluntary interchange between a buyer and seller, because he had something that he wanted, because he saw something quicker and before anybody else did, then that's a completely different matter. So to my mind, it is completely possible for someone to have billions of dollars and to be completely deserve it, for it to be completely fair, because in order to do that, he or she must have provided that much in trade, that much in value to other people. If I provide a couple of bucks worth, $100 worth of services to a few billion people, then I become very wealthy. But that's a very rare and valuable skill.
Bezos, in particular, during this COVID shutdown, where the government has put us under house arrest, if he hadn't, for the last 20 years, been building this evil empire that has put together distribution chains, there are a lot of people who would not be getting the needed supplies that they need to delivered right to their home, who couldn't go out because they're in a vulnerable population.
Or think of the hundreds of thousands of small businesses who now operate exclusively online through Amazon and others as well.
Right? All right, so go into the gray area then of, I'm a guy who sells through Amazon. Amazon now has my data, sees what's going on, and they use that data to either push me down in their search rankings so that their prime deals go up first, or they steal the idea of what I'm doing and they're doing it a little bit cheaper because they have the power. Is that then evil? Is he then breaking that rule you just described, that he created it and he didn't hurt anybody, but now he's using my stuff and he's pushing me farther down the ranks of the search engine?
I don't know. I mean, my gut reaction is, yeah, that's unfair, that's not right. Part of me wonders as well, what exactly did the small business owner agree to? What contract did they sign?
But where else am I going to go? Going back to the first place, I'm selling this widget, and the number one sales way of doing that right now is Amazon. There's no other place. Mind you, we heard the same criticism 10 years ago about Walmart.
Yeah. I guess I'd want to know, I'd want to know more details. I want to know how often that happens. I want to know why, if that's really what Amazon is doing, then why is there anybody else?
It's like a government backdoor, a key that you can look into Amazon and then...
But I do, I guess I'm very, very nervous, and I'd be very cautious about using antitrust law in that way. I mean, the fact of the matter is that if Amazon really has that kind of power, then why are there any businesses in the world other than Amazon? Why is that, right? What is it about the market structure that has caused Bezos to set up his firm in this way, if he really has the power to wipe out every other small business in the country, which I don't believe he does. But it looks like he doesn't want to, because that's not as profitable as doing what he does now. So, yeah, some hypothetical situations could always be constructed, but I am much more interested in how markets actually work, and not that they're perfect, they're always imperfect, but how markets actually work compared to the alternatives. This is really important. When people want to point out the flaws of capitalism when compared to some abstract mathematical perfect entity, that's not fair. You need to understand and compare how markets actually work, which to my mind is pretty darn well because they make things better, goods get better and cheaper and eliminate poverty over time. Compare that to how government actually works. Government, Congress, and the president are not perfect, idealistic, hyper-smart people who always do the right thing and represent the interests of everyone. That's not how government works. That's not how people work. So compare that with how government actually works, that it often is the distributor of privilege, that they transfer wealth from Group A that's relatively fused to Group B that's relatively concentrated, and then they get all the votes for Group B. They put our children in debt, literally trillions of dollars. It amazes me that people are so worried that Congress, as I said, prints money, puts our kids in trillions of dollars worth of debt, fights needless wars, impoverishes America, spends most of its time transferring wealth from Group A to Group B, as I said, and yet people are worried that Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg have too much power. You know, it just doesn't make any sense to me. I'm much more interested, and I frankly, I would much rather live with the imperfections of high-tech firms and the imperfections of the market, such as they are, than the imperfections of a government run amok.
Barry, it's always good talking with you.
Thanks, John. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Go fix the computer upstairs. It's not connecting to the printer again.
Fair enough. I'll send you a bill.
If you enjoyed that conversation, by all means, click one of these other great programs. We have the best conversations with the most fascinating Coloradans. And subscribe to our channel. Just click down below and hit that little bell button too. You don't want to miss a single show.